provision. And you'll see here that literally all I'm doing is I'm just using the sections of the Act. And I'm going to challenge you to see if you can do this, to just print off the section, highlighted maybe, and point out the key facts, rather than bring in a huge thick wad of notes. Now let's get started. And a little thing I should mention, if I don't mention a section, it doesn't mean it's not in the exam. So I'm just focusing today just on the director's duties. Okay, so first up, we have section 180. Now, importantly, it's not section 180, it's section 180, subsection 1. And this is the duty of care and diligence, and also at general law. So never forget that. Has Mary breached section 180, subsection 1, the duty of care and diligence, and also at general law? And so far, everything we need to know about this section is right in front of us. You can see here that it tells us this is a civil obligation only. It does not carry any criminal penalties. And you can totally tell this to the marker, that section 180 subsection 1 is just a civil penalty provision. And so the next important thing is, who owes this duty? We have both directors and officers. And what does it say? A director or officer must act with care and diligence. Do we ever need to write out the whole section? Absolutely not. We know that section 180 subsection 1, if you had to summarize all of this up, basically contains the objective test. So we outline the objective test is of a reasonable person in the same circumstances. And so the important thing that we need to do when talking about section 180 subsection 1, well, first of all, was identifying what the directors did wrong. And drawing on my last example of Mary, so she gave a contract to her sister below market value, maybe Mary released an ASX statement that was misleading, like Hardy. Or she attended a board meeting and didn't properly read the documents and voted on a decision. So all of these things you need to write down, and it's okay for you to put it in dot point, because then when you apply the test, you can see if they have breached that by doing A, B, C, all of these acts that they've done wrong. So after you've identified what the director has done wrong, then the next thing that you need to do is obviously follow the objective test. And so I say this to my students all the time. In the exam, we're not there looking through your exam papers to see if you've highlighted the right key facts. We'll know this from your application. And so here, what we'll be looking for is, well, what does this objective person look like? And what are the similar circumstances or responsibilities of your director? So we're looking for things like, well, tell us the size of the company. Is it a big company? Is it a small company? Is it a public company? Is it a private company? Is it listed on the ASX? Has it been around for 1 year, 2 years? Or has this company been around for a decade? What does this company do? So what is their main course of business? Because remember, we always need to match up what the company's business is and potentially what the director might be doing on the side. So is it connected to the business, or, for example, are they using funds for something completely different? Looking at, is the company profitable right now, or are they struggling financially? What is even the market looking like that they're operating in? So is it the retail sector? How is it performing overall? And then looking at the director or officer themselves. What kind of director are they? Are they a managing director, a CEO, or a non-executive director? What kind of officer? Are they the chief financial officer? Are the company secretary? In addition to that, is there something else unique about them? For example, are they a non-executive director, but they're also the partner of a big law firm or accounting firm? All of these things are really important for you to write down when applying the objective test, because the objective person will need to be in the company's same circumstances and the director or officer's same responsibilities and role. And then never forget to apply the test. So basically, it's either a yes or a no. The reasonable person in the same position would or would not have done the same things that this director or officer did wrong. And so once you conclude that your director has breached Section 180, subsection 1, care and diligence, and the general law, then we need to move to the business judgment rule. So the business judgment rule is a complete defense to a breach under Section 180, subsection 1. And importantly, the business judgment rule contains all 4 elements that you must satisfy. And we know that from the word and. So when you're trying to prove that your director can rely on the business judgment rule, you need to go through each one step by step. But do we need to write out the whole thing? No, because we can do it in shorthand. So the first element under 2 subsection A is acted in good faith for a proper purpose. Now, the key here is, what is the judgment? If, for example, in the top bit here, we listed that the director had done lots of things wrong, think about if there's something where there is some ambiguity. So, if we cast our mind back to the week 8 sample exam question as a perfect example, we'll see that our director was overseas expanding the business. So when we identified that she was absent from management of the company, perhaps this judgment was actually for a legitimate reason. But something like releasing an ASX statement that is misleading, it's unlikely that even if you try to apply all 4 of these, it's not going to get across the line. So you have to identify what is the thing the director did wrong that perhaps this defense can apply to. So making it very clear that we're focusing on, for example, Marianne giving her sister the contract below value. Okay, and we know there's 2 elements to this. The first is good faith. So this is subjective. And this is all directors really believing that what they do is really good for their company. So I gave the contract to my sister because I thought she was the best for the job. So this is very subjective. But when it comes to acting for a proper purpose, that's a little bit more difficult to come by. Okay, so yes, maybe you gave your sister the contract for below market value because she's the best candidate, but were you acting for a proper purpose? i.e., were you giving the company the best opportunity to receive the highest or lowest bid and for the most suitable fit to complete the contract? And then B, we need to look at material personal interest. And so we know from our later sections that material personal interest basically just means something that would influence the way the director votes. And remember to say after each one, if they don't have a material personal interest in the subject matter, you can just give it a tick or say no material personal interest here. So the next one is informing themselves. So this is just, well, if you were presented with a document, did you do your due diligence? Did you read it? Did you inform yourself, or did you just blindly make a decision? That's what we're focusing on here. And then this last element here, I'm highlighting both of these lines because this is an objective consideration. Do you rationally believe that the judgment is in the best interest of the corporation? Going back to my example of giving my contract to my sister, yes, I subjectively believe that, but this isn't an objective one because this line here says it's in the best interest unless no reasonable person in their position would hold that. And if we apply the objective person test, it's unlikely that an objective reasonable person would give a contract to their sister for below market value. So that is the very first defense. So then our next 2 defenses are under section 189 and section 191. And that is the defense of delegation and the defense of reasonable reliance on others. So that's our duty of care and diligence under section 180, subsection 1. What's also key here is don't forget the general law, and we know a wealth of cases that support section 180, subsection 1. I think I've said this before. If you just completely forget about a case in the exam, write down James Hardie's case, because that case stands for every single breach of all of the relevant director's duties. So what do we have? We have our Hardie case. What happened in that case? Well, they released an ASX statement that was misleading. 2, looking at our Centro case. You all know, much better than me, how easy it is to classify non-current and current liabilities. And in that case, the board of directors did not read the huge amount of documentation before them, before they signed off on the report. And so what else do you have? The AWA case, Daniels and Anderson. So this really set the standard that for 180 subsection 1, there's no difference between a non-executive director and an executive director. The standard is absolutely the same. There's really no difference, despite the fact that non-executive directors might only attend a few meetings here and there. They're not involved with day-to-day management. So it's really important for section 180 subsection 1 that you're really across your cases here about catastrophic breaches of directors' duties. Now moving on, and I'm just going in a logical order, straight after 180 is section 181. So we know that section 181 contains 2 components. The first is to act in good faith in the best interest of the company, and the second is acting for a proper purpose. Again, looking at who does this section apply to? And this again applies to our directors and other officers. So it's important to identify, well, who are we talking about here? Are they a section 9 director? Like, for example, if I tell you Terry is the managing director, or if I don't know if they're a director, are they an officer? So maybe they're the CFO or the company secretary, who are definitely officers. So let's look at subsection A. What does good faith in the best interest of the corporation mean? So when we're writing out our rules, again, good faith, much like in 180 subsection 1, this is subjective. Did the director subjectively believe they're acting in good faith? But we need to look at our cases to help us with the definition of the best interest of the corporation. And so, from Park and Daily News, from Russell Kinsella, the courts have said the best interest of the corporation is shareholders as a whole, not an individual employee, not employees like in Park and Daily, where the newspaper had paid out their employees when the company was being sold. The only time, says Russell Kinsella, that you can favour a class of stakeholders is creditors only in the event of insolvency. So this is a really big exception to the best interest of the corporation, means shareholders as a whole. And so how do we know what cases apply here? Well, we don't, because what we do is we look at what the director's done and ask the question, has what the director done hurt the interest of shareholders as a whole? For example, if we were to use James Hardie as an example, by releasing a misleading ASX statement, that caused their share profits to plummet straight after. Again, asking that question, has what they done hurt shareholders as a whole? And the answer will be yes, it has. Now, looking at the second limb, this is really quite limited to scenarios where you're just issuing shares. Are you issuing shares to block a hostile takeover, like Howard Smith and Ampol? Are you issuing shares to dilute your ex-wife's shareholding in the family company, like White House and Carlton? All of these cases focus on section 181 1B because they're asking, when you're issuing more shares, are you doing this for a proper purpose? And we know that a proper purpose to issue shares is, for example, to raise capital. That would have to be the most number one reason companies do that. And so there might be multiple reasons that come up. It might be one reason is that we need capital. But then another reason is we also don't like this company that's trying to take us over. And so what we want to do, like in Howard Smith and Ampol, is to issue shares to another company, a white knight, because we know that if you issue shares equals more control, more power. The more you issue shares, the equivalent of that is that you dilute someone else's shareholding. And so the courts have devised a series of tests. The first is the two-step test from Howard Smith and Ampol. Step 1, it's look at the scope of the power. So they've issued shares. Where did the source and scope of this power come from? Section 198A says the management of the company will lie in the hands of the boards of directors, so they can make that management decision. Also, the Constitution gives the board of directors power. The second step of that test is then to look for what purpose is this power exercised. And this is from the facts, and it could be that they do need capital, that they could be blocking hostile takeover, that they're acting in the best interest of their employees who will be fired if they're taken over. And so the example I've just given you has 3 reasons why this company issued shares. And so the court from Mills and Mills devised the but-for test. Where you have multiple reasons for issuing shares, apply the but-for test. But for the improper purpose, would the company have issued further shares? Or would the directors have exercised their power to issue further shares? And the improper purpose could be, well, in Howard Smith and Ampol it was, but for wanting to block the hostile takeover, would they have issued more shares? And the answer is, if it's no, then they've breached 1811B. And so we'll note here that Section 181 is a civil penalty provision, but it's not only a civil penalty provision. And I'll come back to that in 1 second. And next then we're moving to our series of cases on 182, 183, 191 and 195. And all of this is about managing our conflicts of interest. So let's start with the statutory duties, starting with Section 182. Section 182 is the duty to not misuse your position. And looking at who this applies to, we have directors, officers, and employees. And so my analogy in my podcast was, well, if a person at either Coca-Cola or KFC, an employee, got their hands on the secret recipe to either how to make Coke, which apparently is in a dungeon locked away underneath the ground, or the Colonel's herbs and spices, this could bring a public company to its knees. So the fact that you can't abuse your position really applies across the board. So when you're answering a Section 182 question, you need to identify who you're talking about. So it's Sarah, who's the managing director, or it's Ellie, the CFO, or it's just an employee of the company. And so what you then need to do after you've outlined their position is either outline the advantage for themselves or someone else. So for example, they made a secret profit, that's an advantage for themselves, or their sister's company won the contract because of the information they found out from you leaked it from your position, that's an advantage for someone else, or cause detriment to the corporation. And usually this is that the company has lost profit or they lost the opportunity of a contract. And then closely linked to 182 is Section 183. The same applies. It's to directors or other officers. The only difference is in this section, you need to identify what the information was. So in 182, you had to identify what was their position. In 183, you need to identify what information they misused. So for example, in Green and Bestabel, the director also was in charge of doing the tender for contracts. So in that role, he had that certain information which he leaked to his other company and diverted that opportunity there. As for A and B, you'll notice that this is exactly the same as Section 182. So all you need to write in the exam is as above. And then closely linked to this is section 191. And so what is section 191 about? Well, this is a material personal interest, and it says you must disclose this. What is a material personal interest? And this is where we need to look to our definition in Magellan's case, which is, the test is, it's a material personal interest if it would influence the way in which the director votes. So going back to my example, if it's my sister's company and I want to give the contract to her company, my material personal interest is it would certainly influence my vote because I want to vote for my sister. So that means that's something that I definitely have to disclose. And then we move on to our exam trap number 1. Under 195, why I ask you always to highlight, is this a public company or is it a private company, is because 195 only applies to public companies. It takes it one step further and it says, not only do you need to disclose a material personal interest, you have to step outside. You can't be present while everyone's talking about it. And importantly, you can't vote on it. And I guess the reason is obvious, that you could influence the vote or you could influence the discussion surrounding the vote. So that's our statutory duties to avoid a conflict of interest. I'm just going to quickly flick back here, and what we then need to look at is using all of our cases. So under the duty to avoid a conflict of interest, this is purely now looking at the general law. We kind of have 2 classes of conflicts of interest. Number 1 is the person's made a secret profit or a commission, and that's our Furs and Tomke's case. The second class is, well, are they competing against the company? Have you seen like Cook and Deeks and Canadian Air and O'Malley, where you suddenly see directors start setting up a company on the side, and then all of a sudden they start resigning from their company to work for this other company. This is a separate class which is about competing against the company and diverting a corporate opportunity. And Queensland Hudson and Mines tells us that if you want to do that, you need to disclose it to the board needs to reject it, and then you can resign and take it up in your personal capacity, provided you have the board's full permission and disclosure. So I've listed here lots of cases. When you're talking about a duty to avoid a conflict of interest, it's imperative that you use your cases properly. You can see here on the screen, I've got the 4 steps to using a case. Step 1, identify the name of the case. So when you're reading the facts, hopefully as you're going along, you'll have done enough revision to realize that this sounds suspiciously like another case I've come across or I've learned. So identify the name of that. Just say the applicable case here is, for example, Furs and Tomke's. The next step is identify the key similar or different facts of that case that you've just named to your scenario. So all of the key similar things, they made a secret profit, there was a public company, they set up a side company, they then resigned from it, they never disclosed the material facts. Then the third thing is to identify the outcome of the case. What did the court find? Did the court find that they had breached their duty to avoid a conflict of interest? Did the court order them to account a profit? Those are identifying the outcomes from that case. And then your last step is, well, if you look at your case and you've identified some similar or some different, how are you going to use that case to your scenario? Are you going to either apply the outcome and also say, yes, this director has now breached this duty and will also be asked to account for a profit? Or is it so different that you need to distinguish the outcome and say, actually, in this case, the director disclosed and took it to the shareholders and the board, so therefore they haven't breached their conflict of interest. And then another exam hint is to think about where we use lots of cases. So for example, back in section 180 subsection 1, I went through the Centro case, the Hardy case, AWA. In those types of scenarios, I would want you to go through the 4 steps to using a case and show off your knowledge. Again, looking at our 1811B, Howard Smith and Ampol, Mills and Mills, Nurley and McCann, all of our Whitehouse and Carlton, all of those cases. We also find 2 cases in 588H, which I'm going to go through, DCT and Clark, and Morley and Statewide Tobacco. And then, of course, this topic here, the general law, has lots of cases. So that is an exam hint for you. Now, moving back to 184. So 184 says, if you breach your duty to act in good faith and you're reckless and dishonest and you also use of position. So all that is 181, 182 and 183 here under 184. If you're reckless and dishonest, then this carries with it a criminal offense. And I would definitely want you to say that if you have identified breaches of 181, 182 and 183 or the general law duties, then this is a criminal offense. And now moving on to, I mentioned it earlier, I'll come back here, the director's duty to prevent insolvent trading. And so you have section 588G, which is closely linked to section 95A. And sorry, I should just take you to section 95A of the Corporations Act. So let's start here. An exam hint. How many times have we talked about solvency and insolvency? So we've talked about it when we're looking at the topic of insolvency, but also companies in external administration. So let's start. 588G is another exam hint, a trick, because it only applies to directors' duties. So the previous ones, directors and officers, directors, officers and employees, this is only directors' duty. So how do we know that the company is insolvent? We look at our definition in 95A. A person is solvent if and only if they can pay their debts as and when they fall due. And we know that we need to use the cash flow test because Powell and Fryer told us that. And importantly, what I'm looking for in the exam is for you to apply the factors that apply in ASIC and Plyman. So the court came up with 14 factors. Do you think that in the exam I want you to list all of the 14 factors? The answer is absolutely not. What I want you to do is apply it straight to the facts. Well, for example, on the facts it says hypothetical company A has a poor relationship with their bank, including the inability to borrow further funds. On the facts, we can see that the company is heavily mortgaged. They have no access to alternative finance. We can see that they have had dishonored checks. They can't pay their bills on time. There's a overdue Commonwealth and state tax. For example, I'm telling you that the ATO debt has remained unpaid, or they're not paying their employees super. Familiarize yourselves with all the factors and indicators from ASIC and Plyman and apply them to the factual scenario. Now, going back to 588G. So the first element that you need to satisfy is the person a director? And that's from section 9, and it will just say on the facts, Sean is the managing director of the company. The next element, well, if you've just already done 95A and Powell and Fryer and ASIC and Plyman, all you need to say is, as above. I've already proved this. The last one here, reasonable grounds for suspecting the company is insolvent. And these are things like, well, as directors, they would know that their bills are going unpaid. Have they gone to see a pre-insolvency advisor? Have they come to see a lawyer? Have they gone to see an accountant? What are the facts in the exam question that tell you they had reasonable grounds to suspect that their company wasn't able to pay their debts as and when they fall due? So once you've proven all of these elements, you must conclude that the director has or hasn't engaged in insolvent trading or breached their duty under 588G. But like section 180 subsection 1, there is also a complete defense to 588H, and there are lots of defenses in this section that I want you to talk about. So the first defense is the reasonable grounds to expect solvency. This is an exam trap. This is reasonable grounds to expect insolvency. That is, the reasonable grounds to suspect your company can't pay their bills. This is the opposite, that you actually have grounds to expect your company is solvent. It can pay its bills. And an example that we went through in our seminar questions is obviously big contracts are coming in, big bills are coming in, they're about to be paid. They are able to pay their debts as and when they fall due. The next element here, the defense, is the reasonable reliance defense. So think about, and it's always best to go back to our seminar questions and practice them. Who is a competent and reliable person? Yes, you can totally name another director. You could say that Ali relied on the other director to tell her that the company was solvent. But the problem is you also need to satisfy the second element, that the person is fulfilling that responsibility. And whilst they may be competent and reliable, as we know from Centro and Hardy and all of our cases, directors must be on top of the financial circumstances of their company at all time. You can't rely on another director to tell you your own company is solvent. But it's a different story if you hire an accountant or hire a lawyer to tell you the company's solvent.